Hey, conservation biology students. I wanted to record um, a little video lecture about extinctions in Alabama. One of the things I like having as a continual theme in our course is a focus on Alabama and the Southeast. And you guys know that I've got a thing about birds, and so we're going to talk a little bit about birds here, maybe a lot about birds, but we'll also weave in some other taxa to put it in context. All right, so this topic for this class is extinctions. Pretty gloomy topic because we're in probably the worst, well, we're definitely in the worst time in recorded human history in terms of extinctions on the planet and here in the US and here in the Southeast. Let's start off with recognizing that extinctions, most extinctions look something like this that you see on the picture here. This is a picture of the northern bobwhite, also known as quail. This is a species that's found widely throughout the U.S., but their populations have been dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. Not because people are hunting them too much, not because of a disease or any one thing. It's mostly a combination of invasive species, but even more important than that, it's habitat loss. Quail like habitats that have a lot of grassy and herbaceous layer, sort of a thick layer in the understory, which means that you have to have a lot of light coming through the tree canopy. So quail do really well in prairie type habitats, which have largely been eliminated from the eastern US. And they do well in savanna habitats, which is prairie with scattered trees, which is another ecosystem that used to be widespread in the southeast that has disappeared. So quail when I was a kid, I used to see quail like on a regular basis when I go out bird watching. And now when I see quail, it's like once every few years. Part of that is that I'm not in the places where they're still common, but part of it is that they've just disappeared from a lot of places that they were once common. And this illustrates how extinction happens. It's like gradually, 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 and then boom, they're gone. Not all extinctions are like that, but many are. And all right, so let's learn a little bit more about extinctions in Alabama because this might be one of them in the future. That's why I started with the quail. We'll look at some other species of birds that we have lost in Alabama and what some of those causes are and implications are. First, a little word about some definitions. Extinction means the complete disappearance of a species. It's completely gone. We use another term, extirpation or local extinction, to refer to species that have disappeared from part of its range. So, for example, we can say that the Florida panther or the southeastern subspecies of the cougar, also known as the Florida panther, is extirpated from Alabama. It's not in Alabama. There are occasionally cougar sightings. They're probably pets that people have, and yes, people keep pet cougars illegally, and it's probably pets that have been released. So that's an example of a species that's been extirpated from Alabama, to use that term. We would also say locally extinct. All right, moving on here. So Alabama has lots of really good news about having so many species, and I talked about that in one of our first classes and how we rank number 5 in the U.S. for total species. But if you look at extinctions, Alabama ranks number 2. And islands are a special case. Island species are particularly vulnerable to extinction for a variety of reasons that we will get into later in this course. So if we set Hawaii aside, because it is a special case, and just look at the states that are on the continent, which would include Alaska, of course, Alabama ranks number 1 for total extinct species, and it ranks number 1 by a long shot. California is behind Alabama, but only at about 53 species or so that have gone extinct. And these numbers are ratcheting up as the years go by. Okay, so Alabama's lost a lot of species. We're the number 1 state for extinctions on the continent. We've lost 2 species of fishes, over 30 species of snail, probably more. We just don't know for sure. but definitely, oh, definitely these 31. And we've lost at least 11 species of mussel species. There's one pictured here, the arcuate pearly mussel. And we've also seen some extirpations as well. So obviously, a lot of our extinctions have to do with aquatic species. So we will definitely be circling back to aquatic species in a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at some other stats on species that are threatened and endangered. All of this makes the point that we are not out of the extinction crisis. Alabama might rank number 2 for extinctions right now. It will probably continue to be number 2. I'm going back a slide here. It will probably continue to be number 2 for extinctions for a very long time because we have so many species that are on the endangered species list. This extinction crisis is not just a problem of the past, it's an ongoing crisis. I did not update. This is 2010. Oh no, this is 2020 when I'm recording this lecture. I have not updated these stats since 2016, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. But the overall point is pretty clear. Alabama's got a lot of endangered species. We have 105 T&E species. T&E is jargon in the conservation biology world for threatened and endangered. And that implies that they are on the U.S. endangered species list. Another way of saying that a species is on that list is to say that it is listed, or sometimes you will hear people say it is federally listed to demarcate differences between state lists of endangered species. Okay, so federally listed species, we have over 100 in the state, about 105, and that number has only gone up. It has not gone down since then. Of those species, when I did this tally, 81% were freshwater aquatic species. So that's things like the vermilion darter pictured here on this slide, mussels and snails and crayfishes and so forth and so on. If you look at Alabama, we are ranked number 2 for the total number of endangered animals. So just setting aside plants, but just looking at animals, we're ranked number 2 for endangered animals. What else? And we're ranked number 2 among states for federally listed species as well. Okay, so both overall total T&E species, we're ranked number 2 among states, and if you just look at animals, we're ranked number 2. We're ranked number 4 according to species that are at risk. Now, this takes a little bit of explanation. So the chart that you see at the right was from a report that came out in 2002. And they're not classifying species according to whether or not they are listed on the federal endangered species list or not. A lot of biologists will look at what other biologists have said about the species and whether or not they fit into categories of overall endangerment. And so, for example, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, they have their own list of endangered species, and it's more broader than just the U.S. Federal list that's on the Endangered Species Act. All this to say that there are different ways of categorizing whether species are endangered or not. And with this broader way of looking at-risk species, which is not just the ones that are like teetering on the edge of extinction, but also those that have characteristics that make them vulnerable to extinction. Alabama on that ranking came out at position number 4 there, with about 15% of its species listed as at-risk species. So that's about 1 in 7 species that in Alabama are at risk. And again, that's not the same as federally listed. Federally listed are the worst, the ones that are really endangered. Okay, hopefully that's clear. If not, ask questions in class. All right, so what have we lost? Let's talk about some birds here. This is an artist's depiction of what the passenger pigeon flocks might have looked like when they were migrating. So there are ecologists that do historical work looking at everything from letters to historical documents and anything like that to sort of get an idea of what the world was like back before modern science. And one of the things that's been very well documented is that at the time of colonization by Europeans in North America, the passenger pigeon was the most common species of bird on the continent. There were more passenger pigeons. In fact, and don't quote me on this because we need to verify it, I seem to recall reading that there were more passenger pigeons in North America than all other birds combined, just looking at their numbers. But again, we need to fact check that one. Definitely they were the most common species, that is for sure. You can put that one in the bank. Numerous descriptions describe how during migration times these birds that were very social birds. They loved being together in big flocks. That when they moved over the landscape, flocks were so thick that they blocked out the sun. Hard for us to imagine in this day and age where we've decimated wildlife populations. We've lost, for example, since in my 50 years of living, we've lost 30% of all the birds in North America, in the U.S. Specifically, I should say. So it's hard to imagine in this day and age, like to have flocks that big. But imagine what it was like when the continent was covered up with really good habitat for lots of species, and it makes it a little bit more understandable. So how did we go from having the most abundant species on the planet that are in North America, bird species, how do we go from that to it being extinct? Well, we industrialized the hunting of the species. There was a lot of like rural hunting and stuff like that was sustainable over time, but with the invention of the railroad refrigerator car, it made it possible to harvest passenger pigeons in mass and then ship them to East Coast cities where people would buy them at their local market, and people would have baked or stewed passenger pigeon for lunch or dinner. So here we're talking about commercialized hunting, and that's what you see in the illustrations down at the bottom. You see hunters gunning them down. The tree that's depicted there in the figure on the right is trying to show you that there were passenger pigeons up in the tree as well. The illustration at the right shows a place like a gap on a ridge line, showing a gap in the forest where passenger pigeons would fly through that gap as they're migrating, and you'd have these ginormous nets that they would wind up flying into and sort of piling into, and they'd catch hundreds to thousands of them at a time. Now, the reason that, and I mentioned this earlier, the reason that the passenger pigeons were so vulnerable is that they were extremely social. They traveled together in large flocks, which made them easy to find, and they nested like in big colonies. They would find an appropriate sized patch of forest, and then they would nest in the same trees, sometimes thousands of nests in the same tree. And what would happen is the hunters would sit there and wait until the young in the nest were almost ready to fly. So they were big and fat, but not quite ready to fly. And then they would either build fires underneath the tree to kill them by smoke, or more often they would just cut the tree down. And as the tree came down, then they would then pick up all the dead or dying young passenger pigeons, which were called poults, Poults. And then, they defeather them or whatever they do, gut them, defeather them, and then put them on these carts and ship them to the cities for eating. Because the bird was so obvious in the landscape, and because they hung out in these huge groups and nested together, it made it easy for the hunters to find them and to hunt them, and eventually to completely eradicate them. The last passenger pigeon died in, I think, the Chicago Zoo around 1917, 1919, something like that. All right, so the take-home lessons here are as follows. First of all, very common species can wind up being put to extinction. Number two, subsistence farming or hunting is usually fine, but when you commercialize the harvest of a wild species, that's going to often bring their populations to close to extinction or all the way to extinction. And we've seen this with passenger pigeons. We've seen this with lots of other species, like fish species and all sorts of things. Here's another bird example. This is the Carolina parakeet. This is a species of parakeet that was native to the southeastern U.S., the only native species to the southeastern U.S. And the parakeets would fly around in flocks. They're a very social species, but the flocks were not as big as the passenger pigeons. The problem with the parakeets is that they would sometimes fly into fruit orchards, like peach orchards and things like that, and they would start eating on the fruits, and the farmers that would come out and they would shoot them and kill them. It was, back in the day when you just had a musket and you shot one musket ball, you couldn't possibly take out a flock. But once guns like shotguns were invented, you could take out several at once. And even if you just winged one of these parakeets, what would happen is it would drop to the ground, and instead of the rest of its flock mates flying away in fear, they would drop to the ground to see like why their buddy, so to speak, to anthropomorphize here, they'd fly down to the ground to see why their buddy was injured. Some birds do this. Some people I know have seen shorebirds do this, and other birds do this as well. And so they would come down and investigate why their comrade was on the ground dying or dead, and then the next shotgun blast would take out the rest of the flock. Okay, so that was some of the hunting that led to parakeets. They weren't small birds, probably not very edible, not much meat on them, but they were gunned down for that reason. However, there was something that was commercially valuable about the Carolina parakeet, and that was its feathers. For a very long time, in the 1800s and into the 1900s, it was strangely fashionable for women to ornament their big fancy hats with feathers and sometimes entire birds. I was recently reading about how in places like New York City, you could go to a store that specialized on decorating hats, and there would be thousands of little drawers with different types of feathers from species from all over the world that had been hunted. The feather trade was brutal. There were professional hunters that would go into, for example, coastal areas in Florida and Louisiana and Texas, and basically gun down every bird that they could find. And they were very good shots, and they were very well armed, and they almost eradicated dozens of species. It took years for them to come back. There was eventually outcry against that, which led to the formation of the Audubon Society, and there was also led to the passage of one of our very first conservation laws in the U.S., the Migratory Bird Protection Act. I don't remember the exact year, but it was at the turn of this previous century, early 1900s. And so the parakeet, being very brightly colorful and easy to kill, was one of those species that was very popular in putting on hats, as you see this young lady doing here. I know it seems ridiculous to think about sophisticated people walking around with dead birds on their head, but fashion changes. I mean, what are they going to say about our fashion tastes? They're already complaining about my cargo shorts, so who's to say? All right, so all this led to the demise of the Carolina parakeet. Again, commercialized hunting was really, or the interference with commercialized harvest of fruit is what really led to the species being decimated. So those are two very well documented cases of extinction in the Southeast. There are other species that have disappeared, and they disappeared at a time before we were doing much science. It was mostly there are just a few people doing some observational notes. We didn't have a lot of good science methodologies or equipment or anything like that back in the day when a lot of these species disappeared. And for that reason, we often don't know why they disappeared. This is a species of Eastern North American warbler, these small birds that you could fit a couple of them and would rest in the palm of your hand, for example. And they're usually brightly colored like this one. And they're known as warblers because they're really good singing. They can do a lot of really high-pitched melodies. And the Bachman's warbler disappeared. The last one was seen. When was that? I think the last one was seen like in the 1950s, and one had not been seen prior to that for like a very long time. The Bachman's warbler, we know it existed because we've got specimens in museums, and we've got the picture from mid-century, last century, of probably one of the very last ones alive in the wild. There's been a lot of speculation as to why it disappeared. The common one you'll hear is the eradication of a type of habitat on our floodplains in the east called the canebrake. I'm very skeptical of that because the canebrakes were probably an artifact of the genocide against Native Americans, where European diseases and actually African diseases that the Europeans picked up and brought to North America led to genocide first by disease and then by outright prosecution and war against Native Americans, and sort of led them away from their lands. And a lot of those lands along rivers were recolonized by cane. So obviously this bird's been around for millions of years, even before Native Americans were on the continent. So I've always been skeptical of the canebrake hypothesis, but I don't have any other suggestion because there's not much known about this species. So all this to say that with a lot of our species that have gone extinct in back in time, we know that we're responsible somehow. That is a very good probability, very high probability, but we don't know the exact mechanism. All right, to get away from birds for a few minutes here, this is a species, another Alabama species that is extinct. This is the Hairlip Sucker. This is a species that was native to the Tennessee River, which stretches from east to west across the northern part of Alabama. And of course, you go east of Alabama and it's all up into the mountains of eastern Tennessee and so forth. So this is the biggest river in the southeast, east of the Mississippi River anyway. The last of the hairlip suckers was collected in 1893. So that's even before there was widespread damming on our rivers. So again, there's speculation here as to what caused it. The speculation I've seen was overfishing. The suckers like to travel in big schools. They're a relatively large river fish and would have provided a lot of protein for early settlers in the region. But again, there's mystery associated with that. Now here's our other species of fish that is officially extinct in Alabama. There's the two of them, and that's this one, the white-lined top minnow. Just a little tiny guy about the size of one of your fingers. It was only found in one creek, and that creek is Spring Creek. And there's a gazillion spring creeks in Alabama. This is the one that was in Madison County, and very specifically, it's the one around which the city of Huntsville was built. The spring provided a source of clean drinking water, even during the dry season and even during dry years. And so springs have often attracted settlers. Unfortunately for this fish, the only place that it was found in the entire world was this one creek that flowed from where Huntsville is now down to the Tennessee River. And so much water was extracted from the spring during some years that the spring run down to the river actually went dry. So all fish died in it, including this top minnow. So in this case, we didn't harvest this species directly like we did with the passenger pigeon or the Carolina parakeet. Instead, we were using up this organism's habitat. Basically, it's water. Okay, so this is one example where we do know what happened. All right, another extinct species in the southeast. This is a subspecies. This is the eastern elk. There is a western elk, and it's doing fine, but we did have a variety of elk that was found in the eastern U.S. And it was very quickly overhunted. And already, I mentioned earlier there were prairies in the eastern U.S. They were very patchy prairies. They were here and there. That doesn't mean that there weren't some large prairies, but the point is that it wasn't like the Midwest where you had like rolling prairie habitats for like hundreds of miles or anything like that. And so because the prairie habitats were kind of patchy in the eastern U.S., where these guys would graze, the populations were never as huge as they are now in the western U.S. And so it was very easy to overhunt these populations to the point that they couldn't keep up with it, and they died out or were just actually hunted out, combination of both. American bison, same story. We used to have bison in the eastern U.S., and they were overhunted. There were bison in Alabama. They were all the way down into Florida. But big old chunk of beet out there looks pretty good to you if you been eating corn for the last 3 months. And so it wasn't long before white settlers, armed with guns, were able to take down these eastern herds. Native Americans certainly hunted them, but because bow and arrow and prior to that spear technology wasn't strong enough to take out many of them at once, the harvest of the American bison was sustainable. Of course, once Native Americans got a hold of guns, they also helped contribute to the demise of some wildlife populations, including the white-tailed deer. We almost completely lost the deer because of hunting by both Native Americans and white settlers in the eastern U.S. But fortunately, the deer survived. Yeah, this is just a pretty graphic photo of, those are all bison skulls. You can read the description here of of why there's this ginormous pile of bison skulls. It's a pretty famous picture if this doesn't have all the information you want to figure out what happened here. But basically, people were just gunning down bison all the time. In the West, it was they did that in order to quote unquote tame the prairie, because bison didn't give a shit about barbed wire. They would just push their way through barbed wire. The cows, on the other hand, they didn't like to get torn up by barbed wire. So basically we replaced bison with cows and herded cows by fences and things like that. And the bison were just standing in our way of progress. Fortunately, the American bison did survive in the West, but like I said, the eastern bison is long gone. Computer frozen here. Let's see. There we go. Now here's a species that there's one of two that I'll mention that we're not sure whether it's extinct or not. If you had to go with the data about this species, the Ivorybilled woodpecker, you'd have to conclude that it is extinct. This is a woodpecker. It's a type of bird. Obviously, it's a woodpecker that would be about crow size, a little bit larger in this case. And this is the largest North American woodpecker, and it was so big that its nickname was the Lord God bird, because when people would see it and weren't accustomed to see it, they'd see it and they'd be like, Lord God, that thing is big. So apparently that's the way the story goes anyway. This bird was a specialist on swamp forests with very large cypress trees. It would venture out into adjacent forests that also had large trees. It needed large trees because it actually hammers into the dead wood on trees to pull out beetle grubs, like really big beetle grubs, the size of like my thumb, for example. You need a big woodpecker like this, needs big grubs. And when there was so much logging in the eastern U.S. in the late 1800s and then through the 20th century, that most forests everywhere were cut down. There's only like one patch of forest that's never been cut in Alabama, and it's just a few acres in size, and just one patch in Georgia, for example. So this bird was basically eradicated, maybe caused to be extinct because of habitat loss. Now, the reason I got a question mark here is that there's a team from Auburn that has some evidence that there's a population down in the Florida Panhandle. I've reviewed some of that evidence, and I personally think that there is a population that still exists down there, and it's one of my lifelong bucket list goals to go down there and help rediscover the species. But a whole bunch of people have tried that, and the remaining birds that are down there are so skittish right now that they have it's really hard to get a photo of them if they exist. So this is kind of like Sasquatch right now. So like I said, if you go with the data, you have to classify this one as extinct. I did mention, you might have noticed, I said that if there is a remaining population, the individuals are really skittish, like really scared of people. That's not just to cover up the fact that maybe they're extinct and that's why you can't find them. It's because of science. When back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, museums around the world built out their collections of birds. And by a bird collection, what you do is you kill the bird, you gut it, and you basically you strip the skin with the feathers off of the bird, and also include the beak and the legs, and then the rest of it you get rid of. And then you stuff basically that skin with a variety of things, anything from like sawdust to cotton and that sort of thing. It's more complex than that. Some of you might have done that in vertebrate zoology if you've taken that course recently. And when the word got out that this species was about to go extinct, guess what happened? Museums around the world sent their best hunters to the southeast to gun down the last of these to make sure that they had some of these ivory-billed woodpeckers in their collections. Isn't that ridiculous? It helps illustrate how the conservation ethic is still a relatively new concept to us in at least in Western society. So anyway, a lot of mystery associated with this bird, tragedy and mystery all mixed up into one. Now here's another species. This species is back from the dead, and no, I don't mean a zombie here. This is the spring pygmy sunfish, a little tiny thing like half the size of my pinky finger here, at best. I think it's actually smaller than that. And mostly a drab-looking fish, but if you look at the picture at the top right, you can see that it's got some iridescent coloration on it. It's only found in springs that feed into the Tennessee River, and when we started damming the Tennessee River, we flooded those springs. They became part of the reservoir, and reservoir habitats are unsuitable for this species that needs clear water with abundant aquatic vegetation. And so it looked like for a long time we'd lost this species, but then it was found in a spring, and then that species went extinct because the landowner didn't want the federal government like on their land, and so they put herbicide in the spring, killed off all the plant life. Yes, these things happened and still do happen, unfortunately. So we thought that we lost the spring pygmy sunfish again, and then it was rediscovered. So it's actually now in a couple of springs up in northern Alabama, fortunately. All this to illustrate that sometimes for little cryptic species that are hard to find and things like that, sometimes every once in a while we get a bit of good news and find out that they didn't go extinct. There's a couple of cases with snails in the in Alabama in that case. All right. Okay. So that's a wrap. I'll end on this slide. That's what I wanted to go over there with you here is to illustrate some of the extinctions that we've had in Alabama to sort of bring to life some of these numbers, right? I showed you a bunch of numbers about like species extinct in Alabama. It's like, well, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for us here today? Well, it means that you can't go to a state park and see eastern elk or eastern bison. Or that it means that I'll never get to see, or any other bird watchers ever get to see, a Bachman's warbler, and other bird watchers will probably never see an ivory-billed woodpecker, truth be told, or Carolina parakeets, and certainly not see them or passenger pigeons. So it just helps illustrate that we're making the world a much less diverse and interesting and potentially useful place for us if we want to emphasize the utility of other species. We're just making that world a lot less good for humanity as well as for other species by causing extinctions or allowing species to go extinct. Okay, that's it. I just wanted to enrich your life with some understanding about Alabama and some of the species that it's lost.